Hey, Bomb Squad. If you're a comedian or a podcaster looking for an affordable website solution with a modern look, then we recommend Puck's Hub. With a Puck's Hub website, you can set up your new website in minutes with easy-to-use pre-built templates. Puck's Hub websites are customizable and can easily be integrated with other platforms like Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter. The best part? Puck's Hub plans are only $5 per month. We use Puck's Hub for our website at the Art of Bombing podcast, and we think you should too. That's why we've partnered with Puck's Hub to offer listeners a free 60-day trial. Head over to puckshub.com to subscribe and use promo code AOBPOD at checkout for your 60-day free trial, and then pay only $5 per month after that. Take your career to the next level with your own Puck's Hub website today.
Dan Bublitz Comedy Productions.
My friend Dan, he's got a podcast, 'cause all comics need a podcast, and nobody had a podcast called The Art of Bombing. So Dan went out and bought a tape deck. Who knows why he bought a tape deck? Podcasts don't get played on tape decks, but Dan is from the 80s. So hey there, all you funny jerks, come talk to Dan about your work. Tell him all about your worst times. It's The Art of Bombing.
Welcome to an all-new episode of The Art of Bombing presents Between Bombs Callbacks, where we call back the most recent episode. This week, we are calling back episode 276 with Slade Ham. Ham. Slade Ham. You get it? When you put it together, you say it fast, Slade Ham. It has to be a stage name.
What new word does that make?
Slade ham, like cut ham, like you've slayed it.
Oh,
I cut it up.
Guys, that's how slow I'm moving.
Yeah, me too. I not surprised I put that together either. To be honest, with Slade Ham, but it was a great episode, and
it was a great episode.
There's a lot that we're going to talk about that came out of that episode. So this is your opportunity to, if you haven't went back, this is going to make more sense if you listen to this callback after you listen to the episode, so you have the it'll be more contextual, the things we talk about. So
take a minute, go back, check it out. We'll be right here when you get back. All right, good. Glad you were able to pick that up. Here are two things you probably heard in the listen you just gave the episode. Number one, why producing shows simultaneously can help you.
What do you mean simultaneously? You mean simultaneously as performing as a comedian, right? Got to go all the way.
Yeah. So Slade talks about, during a certain time in his career, kind of a formative time, right? Like in the 3 to 5 year range, he was producing a comedy show alongside being a comedian. And I think there are a lot of benefits to doing that.
Oh, absolutely. If you, for one, if you produce a show, a comedy show of some sort, you're creating opportunity for other comedians who can then get a spot, but that also creates opportunity for you to potentially get spots on other shows, because a lot of times comedians book and produce their own shows. So that's one advantage of having your own room. It could lead to more stage time.
Yeah, absolutely. Like your comedy scene, if you're new to it, you have to think of it as a bartering economy. Like you have to be able to bring things to it in order to get things out of it. And I think a lot of new comics walk into it thinking, what can I get? Why am I not on shows? Why did somebody else get picked instead of me? And honestly, if I really am honest with myself and I look around at my scene, a lot of the comics that get booked over and over again, a lot of them are people who are bringing a lot of other things to the scene. They're bringing a lot of opportunities to the scene. They host open mics. They take people with them on the road. They do paying shows. Like you said, they produce their own shows and bring comics to it. So if you're new, don't just rely on the fact that you're funny. Rely on bringing something in to trade with the rest of the group that elevates the scene on the whole.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something to consider too, just a disclaimer. If you come into a new scene and you decide to start a new show right away, maybe you move to a new scene and you're a go-getter and you want to produce a show, that's great, but just do your due diligence and have the courtesy not to try to poach a room from somebody. If somebody's already doing a comedy show at a venue, that's not an indicator that you should go do a show there too. In fact, that's the opposite, especially if it's being regularly produced. And hopefully, if that venue has a good relationship with whoever's booking it, they're going to tell you, oh, if you want to do a show here, go talk to our booker. So, that's one thing just to kind of keep in mind. You don't want to be, because if you go in and try to steal a room from somebody, that's going to have the opposite effect than just creating a new show or a new mic. So keep that in mind. And make sure you're checking out to see when other shows are going on. If you're going to do a new show, it's going to be it's beneficial for you to do a little bit of research to make sure you're not competing with another show. I mean, at some point in some scenes, you will have to compete a little bit, but if you want your show to be successful, it's got to be, you're going to want it in a time slot where it's not competing as much with other shows, unless you're in a big metropolis area where you have, different cities, but they're essentially just suburbs of each other or whatever. But, there's certain situations, but just do your due diligence and do that research on that. So you're not, getting yourself in trouble, because you want this to lead to more stage time. Because another benefit of that is it is stage time. If you are producing your own show or your own mic, that gives you some certain liberties. You don't want to make the show about you per se, because you want your comics that are on that show to feel like it's their show. But one of the liberties is that it gives you time to work out stuff that you're working on. You're creating your own stage time by being the MC, or maybe you do. I think you do this sometimes, Josh, is you have on the show that you produce, you'll have somebody host, you'll bring in a guest host, and then you'll do a guest spot. Or maybe sometimes you'll headline the show or you'll feature, and you don't do it, you're not doing it every week, every time you do your show, but ever so often you do that kind of thing. And that's an advantage of running your own show. You can do that.
That's right. You get a lot of liberties with it. You get to work on your craft. You get a place to perform, but most importantly, you get to add something to your scene. Mm-hmm. I think that's a big piece of it.
Oh, absolutely, adding value.
Yeah, and you get to see how shows are produced from the other perspective. You're more likely to be a good comic when you're on other shows, showing up on time, making sure that you're doing the promotion. When you see it from the producer angle, what's really being asked of a comic. Getting your bio and headshot submitted on time. All those little pieces that producers have to go through, if you can make that easier for them, that's even more likely to get you booked with that showrunner in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't have that episode number, but if you go back and you listen to the episode with Rudy Pavich, who's a comedian out of Minnesota that we had on earlier this year, that's a great episode to listen to if you haven't already, about bringing something to the table in your scene and adding value, because that was something we talked a lot about, because he started, he did video work and graphics and all kinds of things that has led him, and even now he's still going out on the road and getting shows with some bigger name comics. I saw that here, I don't know if it's upcoming or if he's already done it, but I saw he was going to be doing some shows with Adam Carolla in Oklahoma City. And that is part of that, was that when he started doing comedy again, he started trying to find things that could add, value, doing videography for other comics, doing, content creation for podcasts, for comedians who have podcasts, things like that. So there's other ways to bring content, or not content, but to bring value to your scene if you don't want to produce. The only difference is producing your own show leads you to more stage time. So
yeah, but let's think about, that's true. I think of all the different things you can do to contribute to your scene, that's going to be one that gives you a lot of control.
Yep.
What I'll also say is, comics need a lot of those ancillary things, and you just gave some examples, but let's run down the list right quick. People need you to build flyers.
Yep.
People need people who can do sound on a show. So if you want to have a top produced comedy show, have some sound running in the background. Find out walk-up music for your comics. Get somebody who's comfortable running a soundboard in there. If you're comfortable running a soundboard during the show, you can do that. There's, offering to do some legwork on the promotion, getting access to some Facebook accounts and sending emails out. And there's lots of ancillary things that you need to do to produce a comedy show and make it successful that aren't necessarily you being the showrunner or host.
Yep. Oh, absolutely. And that's a good point too with, doing, if you want your production to be even more value, adding things like walk-up music and having a dedicated sound person and stuff. And that's why I recommend, if you can, it's easy to, if you're going to go produce your own show, that's great. But, maybe if you're new to an area and you meet a new comedy friend or comedy buddy, you co-produce stuff, because that helps lighten up the load of doing all that stuff when you bring on a co-producer, because one can be hosting the show, one can be doing production stuff. That's, I produce here in Loveland a handful of shows with, a co-producer. Mostly I let him do a lot of the hosting. I'll do some guest spots now and again. Sometimes I host if he's not feeling it, but I've come in and I'm doing more production stuff. I'm trying to make our show the best. I've added, try to add walk-up music when I can. I have an extra monitor that I hook up, and so that the comics' names are behind them, and it has their Instagram handles and things like that on there, so people can, oh, hey, this comic's on stage. There's all their info. I should go, do that. A lot of our shows, because they are low budget shows, we do pay everybody. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that. We pay everybody, but because they're not doing a lot of time, it's not like they're getting paid a ton. Another thing I've been doing with those backgrounds is putting their Venmo to it and encouraging tipping. So if people in the audience want to tip just a specific comedian, they can.
That's right. You're showing backgrounds for the comic in the show?
Yeah. Yep. I set up a TV monitor that I have. I have it's an extra computer monitor, and I hook it up with an HDMI cable. I have like a 25, 50-foot cable, and I try to set up a sound booth where I can play music. I got it set up to where I can play music via Bluetooth, and then I have the background for when the comic's on stage, and I try to put in the full production. So when people come to our independent shows at these breweries, it's like, oh wow, this is like going to a real comedy club, Yeah. And then the comics then go, and they're like, oh man, this show that Jeff and Dad put on was awesome. It was packed. There was walk-up music. There was backgrounds. They encouraged people to tip us. They promoted our Instagram. They did all these things, and they tell that to all the other comics, and then other comics want to do our show. So
yeah, if you have a show that really works for other comics, whether it's because they get paid well or they feel like they got great exposure from it, they'll talk to other comics, and they will I guarantee you, be contacting you to be on that show. And then the quality of the performances go up. The audience appreciates it more, and it really builds on itself. I'm sure Slade Ham would agree with that.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And, and that's the thing too. He had a lot of great insight on comedy. One thing that he talked about, is that having comedy adjacent work of, it's the unfortunate part is that with comedy, it isn't necessarily, you can't necessarily sustain a living income just on stand-up alone until you get to a level where you have some sort of drawability. And until you get there, until you have a big following, or until you have that drawability, you have to do other things adjacent if you want to make comedy how you make money.
Yeah, if you just use empirical data, Slade Ham is an incredibly successful comedian. Now, did I know who he was before we had him on the show? No. Now, is he well known the way that, I don't know, Dave Chappelle is? No, not at all. But he's a successful comic in that he has a following. People come to shows to see him.
Yep.
He goes to venues, gets invited back to those venues, has an incredibly large array of material that he can pull from, and he talks about doing that on the show, and he's able to do things that I can't, which is, okay, these guys just look like one-liner. This looks like a one-liner crowd. Let's just filter on that material and do an hour of that. I do not have that capability. He does, because he's experienced, and he's an incredibly strong comic, but he would probably tell you that even he needs this adjacent work in order to make a living from what he's doing. Mm-hmm. So yes, he does get paid to do comedy and tell jokes on stage, and that's wonderful. But he gives a lot of examples in the episode of other things that he does.
Yep. Multiple podcasts.
And that creates a lot of material that he can stockpile and then use in a responsible way that builds his audience up even more.
And that's another way, there's kind of a joke about comedians and podcasts and how it's becoming kind of a hacky thing. And yeah, you're right. If you feel that way, that having a podcast and being a stand-up comedian is a hacky thing, it probably is, because everybody does it. But who cares? If you can start a podcast and get a decent following and build a fan base, there are a lot of comedians that they did not break out until they had a podcast. And that's true. Joe Rogan's a good example. He was doing TVs and doing TV shows and things like that, and was always, a pretty well-respected comedian. But I don't feel like he really started to really break and get to the level he is now until he started doing his podcast, because that furthered his reach. He already had, some fans from doing TV and stand-up. He had fans from being involved in UFC, but then he was able to reach a whole new audience with his podcast. Dan Cummings is another example. I've started listening to his podcast. He's always been a pretty fantastic comedian, and he started a podcast, and then during the pandemic, since comedy wasn't going, he focused on it, and he has a huge following, to the point where he went from being a comedian who mostly did comedy clubs to now he just finished a theater tour. And even, I'm sure if you asked him, he would admit that it's because of my podcast. It brought in a new audience for me and helped me build a fan base. So
I would even throw in Pete Holmes.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Exactly.
Same thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Pete, I love Pete Holmes, and I'm a weirdo, as he would call me, because I listen to his podcast. And he had a good, a TV host career back in 2013 and 2014. Mm-hmm. I think he had the Pete Holmes Show, and he's leveraged that into, his HBO comedy, HBO series that he had. The Crashing, I think, was the name of the show. Yep. Fantastic show. It
was a great show.
I loved him as an actor and as a host. I don't love him as a comic in the same way, but I would definitely love to check out his comedy, and it's because of his those podcast.
Other things.
It's straight up because of his podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. And well, if you're a fan of his acting, do you know that he has a guest role in the reboot of Night Court? Did you know he's on that show?
No, I didn't know that.
Did you know
I've seen him in bit parts in Berbiglia movies and these different things that he's been doing. I love him in everything that he's.
Did you even know there was a reboot of Night Court?
I did actually know that.
Okay.
Yeah, but I haven't been paying attention to it.
I've been watching it, and Pete Holmes has he does a reoccurring guest role on the series.
Well, I bet he's hilarious.
Yeah, it's pretty funny.
Check it out now. But yeah, this comedy adjacent work, which in producing your own comedy shows, you do that. That's part of your comedy adjacent work.
It is. One of the first things I started was, not long into comedy, is doing podcasting. You've been at it a long time. Well, just even this isn't my first podcast. Sure. I had one that I did years before this, when podcasting was just kind of starting.
Right.
Podcasting had only been around for a couple of years, and I had another podcast with some other comedians when I was a newer comedian that we had out. And then, and then eventually that, we quit doing it, because, I moved away and things were, it wasn't as easy then to do remote recording as it is now. Technology has changed in the last 10 years. But that being said, this isn't, and this podcast is another thing that's comedy adjacent, and I've been doing it for 6 years. We've had this podcast for 6 years now. Yeah. So, not that,
and
I don't know that people are listening to this podcast and then coming to my shows to see me, but
it could be. I don't know.
This is what I will say about this podcast, just real quick, is I don't think people are coming to see me perform comedy because of this, but when comics run into me, if I'm like in their scene and I drop in at a show and then they realize I'm the one behind the art of bombing, they get a kick out of that. They're like, oh, I listen to that all the time. So it happens at like comedy festivals, or if I'm visiting another town and I pop into a show, stuff like that. So that's really cool.
Yeah, that's happened to me too. I mean, hey, I was listening. I've been an Art of Bombing fan for a while, but now you're on it. That's interesting. I've had that exact conversation. But comedy adjacent work, I do it as well. I train salespeople, and I bring my stand up comedy into that, and it's something that I've talked about this on here before, but it creates equity.
It does. Well, real quick, let's just talk about some things that you can do comedy adjacent, like what you do. You're coaching salespeople. There's a little bit of, public speaking and stuff involved in that. That's a career that you can do full time, make a pretty good living, and you're working all your tools that you can then apply to comedy. But other comedy adjacent things, copywriter, that's an example. You can be a copywriter for freelance. You can do a lot of freelance work where you're doing freelance copywriting or freelance writing, because a lot of companies, they want creative people. They don't want to just put out boring content. They want something that's going to be a little humorous. And so
that's right.
You can get a job, freelance, doing a little bit of writing, and then you're working on that skill, your writing skill. Sure, it doesn't apply necessarily to stand-up comedy, but you're still using the tools. And it's comedy adjacent. It really is.
Yeah. And, commercial agents, people who, submit talent, like talent agents.
Yep.
Who, submit for commercials, love comics.
Oh, absolutely.
It's because comics are writer performers. And they all know that the level of writing that goes into writing commercials is crap. And they know that if they bring you into it, that you can essentially help them workshop a lot of the copy that's in the commercial just by performing it.
Especially if you got a background in improv.
Yeah. And so improv could be, there's not a lot of improv gigs out there that pay, but there are
some.
No,
I'm saying
as another comedy adjacent thing. That's what I was getting.
Well, okay. You could do improv as a comedy adjacent thing, but I was just saying having that skill set can definitely help you with what you were talking about. They look for that, background in comedy, background in writing, background in improv. Cause again, then they can really, if you have those things, you can help them punch up whatever material it is that they're, trying to record. And that's another adjacent job, is not just commercial, but like just acting in general, doing local theater, doing, there's, a lot of times you got the murder mystery theaters and things, and they're always looking for actors, and those are supposed to be cheesy and fun and funny, and, trivia hosts, that's another thing.
Ooh.
Bar trivia, doing like, bar events. If you like karaoke, hosting karaoke, because you're also, one thing I noticed, I haven't done where I've hosted trivia in a while, but when I lived in San Diego, that was one of my side gigs, is I hosted a weekly trivia, and it gave me the opportunity to, one, I was getting paid to be there, and I got a little tab, so I got, some drinks and some food, and I got to be in front of an audience, and I could test jokes, like I could take some of my material and incorporate it into the whatever the trivia was, and perform at a certain level, because as the host, you want to be entertaining. So I was able to work my performance skill, where, hey, I'm in front of an audience, I'm making them laugh. Not necessarily doing, traditional stand-up, but I'm being funny and charming, and these people are enjoying it. So that's another comedy adjacent thing that you can do.
And here's another one that I thought of. Audio and video editing.
Yep.
as comics, how much of that are we doing already? Like, editing things to send off to festivals, or editing something to put out as content. All those different pieces, there are lots of businesses out there that need help with that. And being a freelance videographer or editor of video, or editor of audio is another thing that you're already doing that you can bring into it.
Oh, absolutely. And that's something not only can you do for other businesses, you can do for other comedians, because there's a lot of comedians that don't want to dedicate the time, and they would rather pay somebody. Even some of the like bigger name comedians, they're paying freelance people, like freelance comedians, to do. I know a handful of comedians that, Rudy's one, for example. He does some content creation for some other comedians. I know some comedians in the Colorado area that have been doing some, they've been doing captioning for videos for podcasts and for people's stand-up clips that they put on Reels and TikTok and things like that. So if you have the capabilities to do any kind of editing and, audio and video editing, and being able to do some graphics as far as like, at least captions and stuff, that is a way that you could, get some freelance work.
Yeah. And he's a good example of somebody who does, like the fact that his podcast, I think, is actually about comedy and the Enneagram.
Mm-hmm.
And Rudy Pavich, by the way, is episode 243 for those of you who want to go back and check his episode out. But yeah, Rudy has a lot of this same conversation about comedy adjacent work with ideas. If you want to mine the show for some ideas, go back and check out 243 with Rudy Pavich.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and going back to Slade, some other things that he does, and this is a little more, you got to have a little more gumption and really be into it. But he started, directing other comedy specials and producing comedy specials.
Yeah.
I mean, he's even got his own comedy special that he's got coming out that we talked about on the podcast. And, he was doing a Kickstarter for it, and he's trying to raise the money so that he can produce it himself. That's more comedy adjacent, because putting that content out there, if you put in comedy, if you go independently record a special, or you put, comedy album out, that's potential for, the album to sell it. There's potential for the comedy special. A lot of comedians now are putting stuff out on YouTube because they can get that ad revenue. If you can put out things that give you passive income as well, that's comedy. It's not necessarily comedy adjacent. It is comedy, because you're making money from your stand-up, for whether it's audio or a video situation. So thinking about ways that you can get to that level of, what if I put out, a little album or a comedy special on YouTube, and then I'm able to monetize that, and get that passive income where you've got money coming in and you don't have to worry about doing all the stuff, selling merch or whatever it might be to try to get people to, give you your money. You're just generating it passively.
There you go.
Yep.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of helpful stuff.
It is. I do want to touch real quick, because I just have an interesting story about this. Is one thing he also talked about was following other comedians, and where the difficulties and the challenges that you can come into that. And I don't know how you feel about it. I'm a lot better about it now, but I used to be, if I had to follow a bigger name comedian, I would get really nervous about it, because they would go out and crush. And this isn't something, every comedian is going to experience unless you're in a bigger scene like, LA or New York. And for me, that's where it happened, is in the LA area multiple times. I had to follow, and I don't even know if he's still doing comedy now, but he was really blowing up at the time, this comic, Dylan Garcia. And he was on the Gabriel Iglesias tour, the Stand-Up Revolution. And so he was on Comedy Central, had a big following on Twitter, and then he went on tour. They did the Stand-Up Revolution tour or whatever. And so I was performing at the comedy club in this casino in the basement, and Gabriel had his big show up in their big theater. And some of those comics, because we're greedy for stage time, they dropped down and did guest spots on the show, and I had to follow them. I ended up having to follow this Dylan, and he crushed. And I got super nervous, and I felt like I bombed. It was bad.
Right.
And then another time, I had to follow Arsenio Hall, at the Ice House.
Oh my Lord.
And that was a little
was it like his crowd? I mean,
no, he just was doing a pop in. Like
Okay.
it was when he was getting ready to, I think he was working. He was just kind of getting back into stand up, or he was working on getting some stuff together to do a special. And he, I get to the Ice House and I know where I'm supposed to be or whatever, and check in with the MC, and the MC goes, all right, just to let you know, Arsenio Hall's going to come in. He's going to pop in. He's going up right before you. You'll be on after him. So good luck. And I was like, okay, cool. How much time is Arsenio doing? And the host goes, as much as he wants. And so not only did I have to follow Arsenio, I didn't know how long he was going to do.
Exactly,
so I had to be ready.
I
had to be ready for the whole time. And he did like 45 minutes. And of course he crushed. So he did like a full headlining set. And I just had to be ready for 45 minutes.
Yes. Yeah, that's insane, man. Yeah, especially the X factor of I don't know when this is going to be over.
Mm-hmm.
So you're there expending all this sort of anticipation and energy the entire time he's performing, and it could be over in 4 minutes or an hour. Like
exactly. But I will say the difference between when I followed Dylan and when I followed Arsenio was experience and talking to other comedians who, by this time, I had it in my head that it doesn't matter who goes before you. You need to be able to follow anybody, whether it's somebody that's performing for the first time or a big celebrity. You need to be able to, you're a comedian. They're a comedian. You are colleagues. You need to be able to go out and follow your colleague and do a good job as well, because you're both comedians. So, and that was the difference. Did I crush after Arsenio Hall? Not by any means, but I did fine. I wouldn't have considered it a bomb, not like I considered the other one.
Yeah, that's true. I haven't had to follow anybody with a name that people listening would recognize, but I have had to follow comedians who crushed, who were more polished, more experienced, and I'd say better comedians than me.
Well, in the episode, he talks about following Mike Baldwin, I'm sure
I've had to follow the same comic. Yeah,
I was going to say he started in the Kansas City area, I think.
Okay, I didn't actually realize that.
Yeah, I think that's why Mike Baldwin is in that area a lot.
Yeah,
because he's from that area.
Yeah, Mike Baldwin is from near here.
Oh yeah, that's what I was saying. Mike is from Kansas City area.
Okay. I thought you were
not Slade. No, I'm talking about Mike.
Right. Yeah, Mike is. And yeah, I've been on I've shared, stage with him a couple of times, and the time I had to follow him was when we were doing a video series. We were going in and they were producing videos of our sets to put up on their channel.
Oh, gotcha. Yep. Doing like,
and it was a great audience. And that night I learned, okay, somebody goes up and crushes. I'm not going to reach the level he reached. Okay. Let's just get there. But this audience is ready for comedy. And if I get in my own head and try to compare myself to the comic that goes before me, or try to emulate their energy somehow and do something that I'm not capable of, that's going to hurt me. Mm-hmm. Now, I think Slade gives us a good lesson on that. He says, well, you have to, I think what he was saying, and I'm not trying to put words in his mouth, but I think what he was saying is that if the comic before you has a certain kind of energy, you need to understand what that does to the crowd.
Yep.
And not try to come out in a way that doesn't recognize where the crowd is in that moment. But he's also not saying to not be yourself, right? So I'm not Mike Baldwin, and I'm not going to do jokes like Mike Baldwin. And I'm not going to, right? So, but I do need to recognize that the comics that the audience is used to, a certain kind of energy, and let's at least acknowledge that, right? Because I've really kicked myself when something like that has happened, and then I go out after a comic and try to emulate that exact kind of thing.
Yep.
That falls apart.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, essentially, you just have to address the elephant in the room, and whether you just make it blatantly obvious and you just say, you go out to the crowd and say, hey, give it up for your last comic. They were fantastic. I'm going to be the opposite of that. And then, you or whatever it is, you just address that you're not going to be doing what they do, because you basically have to reset the room. Hopefully, if you have a good MC, they're going to see that and try to reset the room for the next comedian. But that doesn't always happen because a lot of MCs, once the show's going, they're just trying to keep it going. So bring up the next comic. They're not really trying to reset the room. But yeah, you have to be able to, if a comic, and this is one thing I would say, if a comic's doing really well and you go and you follow them, one of the easiest ways to not do well after that is to ridicule the comic, try to roast them. Because if the audience likes them and you come on and you try to roast them because you're trying to be funny and like get the crowd on your side, they're not. They're going to hate you. They're going to be like, that comic did well. Why are you being a dick? Stop being a dick to this comic. Didn't you see what they did? We were in this room. They crushed. Why are you being so mean? Address it in a positive way. Same thing if a comic before you bombs, and you need to reset that energy, you can do it in a positive way to where you're not throwing somebody under the bus and coming off as a jerk. Because if you come off as a jerk, you're taking away your likability points. So,
that's right.
Ride the wave. Ride the wave. When a comic's doing well, just ride the wave. Go up there
just keep swimming.
That's right. And get on your surfboard and take it right in to a crush. An orange crush, because it's the summer and we're at the beach.
Oh, wow.
And I'm on fire. And with we better end this callback before I sink the boat.
He's getting into rare form, and the metaphors, the sea metaphors, keep coming.
That's right. Before we know it, I'm just gonna get eaten by a shark, and then we'll lose everything. So hey, thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of Between Bombs Callbacks. We're calling back episode 276 with Slade Ham. Make sure you go check out Slade's. Follow him on social media. If you made it this far and still haven't listened to the episode with Slade, be sure to go back, listen to the episode with Slade. Go listen to the episode with Rudy. Both kind of tie in with the comedy adjacent stuff. So really good input on both of those episodes. And that's going to do it for this week. We'll be back next week.
This has been a Dan Bublitz comedy production. Raw.